The Silent Garden. The ocean had been their world for 66 days. It was a gray, heaving expanse that smelled of salt, wet wood, and fear. For the families huddled in the cramped darkness of the ship's hold, the Atlantic was a prison without walls. They slept to the rhythm of creaking timbers and woke to the howling of the wind. In their dreams, they imagined the land they were sailing toward. They pictured a dark, impenetrable fortress of nature, a hideous and desolate wilderness, as their books had warned them. They imagined walls of thorns, wolves the size of ponies, and a forest so thick that sunlight could never touch the ground. They sharpened their axes and steeled their souls, preparing for a war against the wild. But when the cry finally came from the crow's nest, "Land! Land ho!" and the morning mist began to peel away from the coastline, the silence was the first thing to greet them. Thomas, a carpenter who had left everything behind in England, stood by the rail. His hands were calloused, gripping the salt-crusted wood. He squinted against the pale winter light, expecting to see the menacing wall of trees. Instead, as the longboat cut through the icy surf and crunched onto the sand, he saw something that stopped his breath. The land was not a fortress. It was a park. He stepped onto the shore, his legs wobbling after months at sea. The earth felt impossibly solid, a sleeping giant beneath his boots. He walked up the dunes, past the beach grass shivering in the wind, and entered the tree line. It was nothing like the tangled forests of the old world. Here, the great oaks and pines stood tall and spaced apart, like pillars in a vast, roofless cathedral. There was no choking underbrush, no brambles to tear at his clothes. The forest floor was covered in a soft carpet of pine needles and dried leaves, open and clear. Shafts of golden sunlight pierced through the canopy, dancing on the ground. It looked as though a master gardener had just finished his work, sweeping the floor clean before stepping away for lunch. "It is prepared," Thomas whispered, his voice swallowed by the vastness. The group moved deeper inland, their footsteps muffled by the earth. They walked with caution, hands near their muskets, waiting for the ambush. But there was only the wind. It sighed through the branches, a long, mournful exhale that sounded like a memory of a song. Then they found the village. It sat on a rise overlooking the bay, protected from the harsh winds. It was not a ruin, but a ghost town. The structures were rounded, built from saplings bent with incredible strength, and covered in woven mats of reeds that were still tight and weatherproof. Thomas ran his hand along the frame of a doorway. The wood was smooth, polished by the touch of many hands. Inside, he found a hearth where the ash was cold but undisturbed. He saw baskets woven with complex, beautiful geometric patterns, sitting in corners as if waiting to be filled. It was a home where the fire had gone out only recently. The settlers moved through this silent village like sleepwalkers. They found cleared fields stretching out behind the houses, acres of land that had already been broken by the hoe, the soil rich and black, waiting for seed. They found mounds in the earth, and when they dug into them with trembling hands, they found baskets filled with multicolored corn, gold, red, and blue kernels, preserved and buried against the winter. "A miracle," the preacher murmured, falling to his knees. "God has cleared the way for his people. He has prepared a table for us in the wilderness." The others cheered, weeping with relief. They saw divine providence. They saw a gift. But Thomas stood apart. He looked at the empty fields and the silent houses. He felt the weight of the silence. He was a craftsman. He knew that land does not clear itself. He knew that forests do not become parks by accident. He understood that the open, sunlit woods were the result of centuries of care, controlled burns, management, and stewardship by a people who knew this earth as well as they knew their own skin. He realized that they had not arrived in a wilderness. They had arrived in a cemetery. A great and terrible sickness, an invisible army of microbes traveling faster than any ship, had swept through this coast years before the settlers arrived. It had emptied the villages and silenced the languages, leaving the fields fallow and the granaries full for strangers they would never meet. That night, the settlers slept on solid ground for the first time in months. They slept in the houses of the vanished, warmed by the wood gathered by hands that were no longer there. Thomas lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind rattling the reed mats of the roof. He thought about the corn in the baskets. It was life. It was the only reason they would survive this winter. They would eat the bread of the ghosts. They would plant the seeds of the lost in the spring. The narrative of his people would become one of conquest and bravery, of taming the wild. But lying there in the dark, enveloped by the scent of dry grass and old smoke, Thomas knew the truth. This was not a conquest. It was an inheritance. America was not a blank page waiting to be written upon. It was a book already full of stories, where the previous chapter had been tragic and abrupt, allowing the new chapter to begin. Eventually, the rhythm of the wind lulled him. The silence of the vast continent felt less like emptiness and more like a heavy velvet blanket. The land was resting. It had seen sorrow, and now it held the new dreamers in its grasp, indifferent to their origins, demanding only that they tend the fields that had been left behind. Thomas closed his eyes. The ocean was far away now. Beneath him was the soil, deep and patient, holding the secrets of the past and the seeds of the future in the same dark embrace. And finally, he slept.